She never expected one act of kindness to cost her everything. It was a quiet afternoon in a small diner when Emily, a waitress with a heart of gold, made a simple choice. A homeless man, frail and starving, sat at the corner booth, staring at the menu with empty pockets. She had seen people ignore him all day, but Emily, she couldn't. So, she did what no one else would. She brought him a hot meal. And for that she was fired. But what she didn't know, what no one in that diner knew, was that someone had been watching. And in just a few minutes, Keanu Reeves would do something that would change everything. Emily had learned a lot about people in her 3 years at the diner. She knew how to read the ones who were in a hurry, their fingers tapping impatiently against the counter as they waited for their coffee. She recognized the ones who came in every day, ordering the same meal, sitting at the same booth, creatures of habit, comforted by routine. And then there were the ones no one really saw. The ones who sat in the corners, unnoticed. The ones who looked down when spoken to, who counted their change before even glancing at the menu, who carried the kind of exhaustion that couldn't be fixed with just a good night's sleep. The man in the corner booth? He was one of them. Emily had spotted him the moment he walked in. Not because he was loud or demanding, but because he was the opposite. He moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb the air around him. His jacket was too thin for the weather, frayed at the sleeves. His boots, once sturdy, were now worn down to their soles. He sat with his shoulders hunched, fingers tracing the edges of the menu, not in curiosity, but in silent hope. Hope that maybe, somehow, today would be different. Emily had seen that look before. The look of hunger. Not the kind that came from missing lunch. Not the kind that made people complain that their food was taking too long. The kind that settled into a person's bones, that hollowed out their face, that made their hands shake just a little as they reached for a glass of water. She grabbed a notepad and walked over. "Can I get you something?" she asked, keeping her voice light, gentle. The man hesitated. He glanced around, as if expecting someone to tell him he shouldn't be here. His fingers tight and around the menu, but he didn't look up. I don't have any money," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily didn't blink. She had been expecting that. She offered him a small smile. "Then today, you don't need any." His head jerked up, eyes wide with disbelief. Before he could protest, she turned and walked straight to the kitchen, pulling out her own notepad instead of the official order slip. She wasn't going to let this go on the restaurant's tab. This was on her. A hot bowl of soup, fresh bread, a steaming cup of coffee. Nothing extravagant, nothing the diner couldn't spare. But to a man who hadn't had a real meal in days, it would mean everything. She didn't think twice about it, but someone else did. The plate barely had time to settle on the table before the voice cut through the air like a blade. "Emily, what do you think you're doing?" The din of clinking silverware and soft conversations vanished. The low hum of the diner turned into a vacuum of silence. Wherever I turned toward the scene unfolding, Emily felt her stomach drop. She already knew what was coming. Standing by the counter, arms crossed over his chest, was her manager, Greg Turner, a man whose heart was as cold as the metal countertop he leaned against. Greg didn't see people. He saw numbers, profits, bottom lines. And right now, he wasn't happy. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "I was just giving away free food." Greg's voice was laced with condescension, loud enough for the entire diner to hear. He scoffed, shaking his head like she had done something ridiculous. To a bum? Emily flinched, not for herself, but for the man sitting in front of her. His shoulders hunched instantly. His hands, which had just been reaching for the spoon, trembled before slowly pulling back. His gaze dropped to the table, shame washing over him like a tide. Emily's chest tightened. It was one thing to be hungry. It was another to be made to feel less than human for it. She took a deep breath. "It's just one meal," she said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "It's not going to." "I don't care," Greg snapped. His tone was sharp. "Final. Either he pays or he leaves." The man in the corner moved instantly. Not to argue, not to protest, but to leave. His hands fumbled as he tried to stand, his fingers brushing against the plate before hesitating like he wanted to take just one bite. Just one taste of warmth before it was ripped away. I'm sorry," he stammered. His voice cracked, his body already retreating. Emily's heart clenched. The humiliation in his voice. The way his hands shook. The way he looked smaller than before. He had probably been through this before. He had probably been kicked out of places before. Treated like a problem, an inconvenience. A stain on the perfect image of paying customers. Not today. Before she even realized what she was doing, Emily stepped forward, placing herself between him and Greg. "No," she said, her voice firmer now. "He's eating. If you have a problem with that, fire me." The words hung in the air. Greg's expression flickered, as if debating whether she was bluffing. Then he smiled. Not a kind smile, not even an amused one. A cruel, satisfied smirk. "All right," he said smoothly. "You're fired." The diner remained frozen in silence. Just like that, her world shattered. The weight of it all hit Emily like a crashing wave. She had spoken without thinking, had thrown away her only source of income in the blink of an eye. And for what? For a man she didn't know? For a meal that would be forgotten by tomorrow? Her hands trembled at her sides, but she refused to let it show. She would not regret what she did, even if it cost her everything. The diner was a tomb of silence. Customers sat frozen in their booths, their forks paused mid-air, eyes darting between Emily and Greg, as if waiting for someone to break the tension. Some of them looked away, uncomfortable, unwilling to get involved. Others? They looked amused, as if this was just another scene in the never-ending reality show of life, another nobody losing their job. Another nameless struggle in a world that didn't care. Emily forced herself to stand tall, chin lifted. Fine. If this was how the world worked, if kindness was punished and cruelty was rewarded, then so be it. She would walk out with her dignity intact. But then, someone moved. A chair scraped against the tiled floor, slow, deliberate. A man stood up from a booth near the window, his figure calm, controlled. He didn't rush, didn't speak right away. But when he walked forward, there was something undeniable in his presence. Emily didn't recognize him at first, not right away. But as soon as their eyes met, her breath caught. Keanu Reeves. The realization hit her like a lightning bolt to the chest. She had served him countless times before, had brought him coffee without a second thought, had refilled his water glass while chatting with other customers. She had never imagined he was watching, that he was paying attention, that in this moment he would stand for her. Greg's face twisted in confusion. He blinked, processing what was happening. "Wait," he stammered, squinting. "Aren't you?" Keanu ignored him. His focus was entirely on Emily. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice steady. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an opinion. It was a fact. Emily's throat tightened, emotion rising faster than she could control. "It doesn't matter," she murmured. "I still lost my job." Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering her words. And then he smiled. Not just any smile. A knowing smile, a mischievous smile. A smile that held something dangerous. "Not for long," he said. And just like that, everything changed. The air inside the diner had changed. What had once been a simple place where coffee was poured without thought where the scent of grease and warm bread clung to the walls, where people came and went without second glances, had now turned into something else entirely. A battleground. A moment that everyone in the room would remember for the rest of their lives. Greg, the manager, had started this confrontation believing he had the upper hand. He had smirked when he fired Emily, satisfied with his power over her fate. But now he was staring at Keanu Reeves. And Keanu wasn't looking at him with amusement, nor was he looking at him with anger. His expression was unreadable. But there was something behind his eyes, something steady, something firm. A quiet power that no one in that diner dared to challenge. Keanu took a step forward, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Do you own this diner?" Greg hesitated. The question caught him off guard. No," he admitted. "The owner does. Why?" Keanu nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Good." Then, without another word, he pulled out his phone. The sound of the unlocking screen echoed in the stillness. Greg's frown deepened. "What are you?" Keanu barely glanced at him as he pressed a number and lifted the phone to his ear. "Buying the place." The words were so casual, so effortlessly delivered, that it took a second for the weight of them to settle. Then, silence. The entire diner froze. Forks clattered onto plates. A mother with her young daughter at the counter turned, her mouth slightly open. A businessman, halfway through his coffee, sat motionless, eyes wide. No one dared to move. Greg's face went pale. You can't be serious," he stammered, laughing nervously. "You don't just buy a diner like that." Keanu met his gaze, his expression unshaken. "I never joke about kindness." Greg opened his mouth, but no words came out. And then, it happened. Keanu spoke softly into the phone. "Hi, yes, this is Keanu Reeves. I need to speak with the owner of." He paused, glancing at the cheap neon sign above the counter, Sunrise Diner. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged glances. Was this real? Was this actually happening? Greg swallowed hard, shifting on his feet. "Look, man, I think there's been a..." Keanu held up a single finger, a silent signal. "Wait." Greg did. The phone call lasted less than 3 minutes. A polite introduction, a casual inquiry. And then Keanu listened, nodding slightly. Finally, he spoke. "Yes, full offer. Right now, have your lawyers draw up the paperwork by tomorrow." Greg's breath hitched. Keanu pulled the phone away from his ear, pressed a button, and then slid it back into his pocket. He turned back toward Greg, his voice calm but final. "The diner has a new owner." A single sentence. A single moment. And suddenly, everything had changed. Greg staggered. His face had gone completely white, his jaw slack. You can't just do that," he said, though his voice had lost its sharp edge. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I just did." A sharp, nervous laugh bubbled from Greg's lips, but it held no confidence. "Look, this is a misunderstanding. I was just enforcing the rules. We can, talk about this, right?" Keanu's gaze didn't waver. Greg swallowed, sweat forming at his temple. He was realizing something. He was realizing that in one instant, he had lost everything. He no longer had control. He no longer held power. And for the first time, that night he was afraid. The diner wasn't the same anymore. The moment Keanu Reeves slipped his phone back into his pocket, the air shifted. The greasy, fluorescent-lit room, once ruled by Greg's iron grip and unspoken cruelty, now felt lighter. The tension that had wrapped around every corner of the diner like a suffocating fog? Gone. But Greg? Greg still stood there, frozen, as if his brain was still catching up to reality. His face had lost all color, his confidence once so loud, so smug, crumbling like a house of cards. His lips parted, scrambling for words. Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I was just... Keanu lifted a hand, a simple gesture, but it was enough. You're fired. The words cut through the diner like the final note in a song. Final. Absolute. And for the first time ever, Greg had nothing to say. The customers, who had been nothing more than silent observers just moments ago, reacted all at once. Someone at the counter let out a soft, startled laugh. A teenager in the back booth clapped his hands over his mouth, whispering, "No way." An elderly man who had been sipping his coffee let out a low chuckle and murmured, "Well, I'll be damned." Greg staggered, his entire body tensed, like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, suddenly realizing he had nowhere left to go. "You can't," just his voice cracked. "Keanu, come on, I didn't mean." Keanu simply raised an eyebrow. He didn't need to say anything else. Greg knew it was over. With shaky hands, he reached behind his neck, unclipped his name tag, and set it on the counter. It was the first time in his life that he had been the one dismissed, and it stung. Without another word, Greg turned and walked out. The second the door swung shut behind him, the diner let out a collective breath. It was like a spell had been broken. And in the middle of it all, standing motionless, was Emily. She couldn't believe it. Her boss gone, her job gone, but not in the way she had expected. She had thought she was walking away from everything tonight, that her last paycheck would be her last tie to this place. But now she had no idea what was happening. Keanu turned to her, his expression warm. "How would you like to run this place?" Emily blinked. "W what?" she stammered. Keanu tucked his hands into his pockets, completely unfazed. "I just bought it," he repeated like it was the simplest thing in the world. "And I need someone in charge, someone with a good heart." Emily's mind spun. This was a joke, right? A dream? Maybe she had already walked out earlier, and she was just imagining this entire thing. She looked around, searching for some kind of explanation, but all she found were eyes on her, watching, waiting, because this was real. Tears burned at the edges of her vision. "Are you serious?" she whispered. Keanu grinned, dead serious. The words hit something deep inside her. A flood of emotions crashed over her shock. Disbelief, gratitude so overwhelming that she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Her whole life, she had been told to stay in her place, to follow the rules, to never expect too much. But here he was offering her something she had never dared to dream of. Not just a job, not just security, but a chance. A real, honest chance to make a difference, to build something good, to take the kindness she had always tried to give and turn it into something bigger. Her hands trembled as she wiped at her eyes, laughing through the tears. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. Keanu chuckled. "Say yes." She swallowed hard. Then, with a deep, shaky breath, she nodded. Yes. By the next morning, the world knew. The story had spread like wildfire. News outlets ran the headline with shock and admiration. Social media exploded photos, videos, first-hand accounts from customers who had been there, all describing the same unbelievable scene. Keanu Reeves, Hollywood's most beloved star, the man who had played warriors, assassins, and chosen ones. And yet this was the role that stunned everyone the most. The man who had quietly watched a moment of injustice unfold. The man who had refused to stay silent. A man who had bought at Einer not because he needed another investment, not because it was some publicity stunt, but because a waitress had done something good and lost everything for it. And he wasn't going to let that stand. The comments poured in by the thousands. This is why Keanu Reeves is the best human being on the planet. He doesn't just talk about kindness, he lives it. The world doesn't deserve Keanu. but I'm so glad we have him. But Keanu? He didn't care about the attention. He didn't care that his name was trending, that the paparazzi were scrambling to get photos of the little diner he had saved, that reporters were desperate for an interview. That wasn't why he did it. He did it because kindness matters, because a young woman who barely had enough to get by herself had chosen to put someone else first. Because in a world that so often rewards selfishness, punishes generosity, and looks the other way when someone is struggling, she had chosen to do the opposite. And that kind of courage, that kind of heart, it deserved to be rewarded. Emily barely had time to process it all. One night, she was just a waitress living paycheck to paycheck, working long shifts, scraping together tips to make rent. And now she was running the very place where she had once been an employee. It was overwhelming, exciting, terrifying, and yet, for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the future. She spent the first morning walking through the diner, running her fingers over the countertops she had wiped down 1,000 times before, but this time they felt different. This time they belonged to her. She greeted the regulars, who no longer saw her as just another employee, but as something more. They clapped her on the back, told her they were proud of her, reminded her that what she did helping that man, standing up for him when no one else would, was worth it. And the homeless man she had fed, he came back, not out of desperation, not because he expected anything, but because he had to see it with his own eyes. He had to know that this wasn't a dream, that the woman who had shown him kindness was now the one in charge. When he walked through the doors, Emily spotted him immediately. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then she smiled. "Welcome back," she said softly. The man swallowed hard, glancing around, as if making sure no one would yell at him this time. And then, when he was sure, he sat down in the same booth. The same booth where everything had started. The same booth where one small act of kindness had changed both of their lives forever. Emily didn't ask if he had money. She didn't have to. She simply turned to the kitchen and called out the first order of the day: a hot bowl of soup, fresh bread, and a steaming cup of coffee, because that's what this diner would be from now on. Not just a place to eat, a place where kindness would always come first.